Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Camfield. Just kidding. Can you imagine? My name is Saima Desai, and I am hosting this episode of the podcast today because today I'm interviewing David Camfield about his new book, Red Flags, A Reckoning with Communism for the Future of the Left. So, I've known David for about 7 years. We met back when I was the editor of Briar Patch magazine. Briar Patch is a magazine of grassroots politics based in Treaty 4 territory in Saskatchewan. These days, I live in Toronto, where I work as an editor and a journalist, and I'm involved with a Toronto arts and politics magazine called The Grind, and also with the publishing house Between the Lines Books. Toronto, where I live, is the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Wendat, Chippewa, and Haudenosaunee. When we acknowledge the Indigenous nations on whose land we live, we need to also work alongside them to fight against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, a community working to promote left podcasts in Canada. You can check them out at harbingermedianetwork.com. So, if you are a regular listener of Victor's Children, you know David Camfield. He's a revolutionary socialist, a prolific writer, and a professor at the University of Manitoba. His books include Future on Fire, Capitalism and the Politics of Climate Change, We Can Do Better, Ideas for Changing Society, and Canadian Labour in Crisis, Reinventing the Workers' Movement. He's also the regular host of Victor's Children, but today he's handed over the reins to me so that I can interview him about his new book. At Briar Patch, I often called up David when I needed someone to intervene in some of the most calcified and intractable disagreements you'll find on the left. When he wrote for Briar Patch, he brought such a deep knowledge of radical history and an unshakable commitment to socialism from below. That's why I'm so excited for his new book, which is called Red Flags, A Reckoning with Communism for the Future of the Left. It's forthcoming from Fernwood Press in April 2025. The book starts from where we're at right now. To more and more people, it's becoming clear that capitalism is an inhumane and unsustainable economic system. Those people are looking for alternatives, and they're finding socialism and communism. Then, they want evidence that these ideas can work on the ground. They want socialist success stories. And they're looking at what's often called actually existing socialist countries. These are countries like the USSR, China, and Cuba that once called or still call themselves socialist or communist. But Red Flags asks, what is the path to communism? And were these societies ever really walking along it? The book looks at the track record of these countries and their ruling parties. It starts with the 1917 Russian Revolution and traces a path through the creation of the USSR and China and Cuba after their respective revolutions. Using the tools of historical materialism, David argues that these societies were never on the road to communism. They were class societies. In each of them, at their top, you'd find a party or a bureaucracy that was making decisions on behalf of workers, and inevitably exploiting the labor of workers. This exploitation is the very thing that communism seeks to end. What Red Flags offers instead is a vision of what communism actually is, and how to get there. It argues that communism is inherently about democracy. It must be built by and for the working class, not any other group acting on behalf of the working class. And it says that if what we seek is human liberation, going down the path of actually existing socialism and its ideology of Marxist-Leninism is a dead end. David, welcome to your own podcast. I am so excited to talk to you about your book.
Well, thank you so much for this, Simon. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm really looking forward to this discussion.
Me too. So let's start off with a question about what led you to want to write this book and why now?
Well, I think I first began to notice the growth and interest in Marxist-Leninist politics and that kind of thing maybe a decade ago. And then it was, I think, picking up more 5 or 6 years ago. And, as I guess over time, it became clear to me that this needed more serious responses than it was getting. Responses that were not just asking people to read contributions to debates from the past, but to kind of situate the debate in the present. So that's what led me, when I had the opportunity to do this amount of writing, to take it on. And I think we've seen, for understandable reasons, a growth in people wanting to reject the anti-communism that we hear from both the far right, but also from the liberal establishment, since anti-communism says that any attempt to radically change the world is going to end up with some totalitarian nightmare. And so people push back against that and often adopt what I call, it's not my own original term, but anti-communism as a stance. In other words, rejecting anti-communism from a perspective that's at least somewhat sympathetic to the so-called actually existing socialist societies. And that doesn't have to be, but is often a kind of a gateway to embracing Marxism-Leninism, and affirming that so-called socialist societies are the kind of society that we need. And so I think these are real trends, and they have negative consequences for the left, and the book tries to respond to those.
Yeah. So you point to seeing this rise in anti-communism on the left over the last 5 to 10 years, and a lot of what we see in the book is clearly, kind of quite a pointed rebuttal or attempt to address some of the common arguments that you would see among some anti-communists. In what venues do you sort of see those ideas taking hold? Where are they spreading? Where are they being developed?
Before I answer that, I wanted to maybe sketch that as an alternative to the anti-communist response. The approach that I think we need to take is in some ways encapsulated by a slogan: the communist world is not communist and the free world is not free. In other words, rejecting both the way that society is organized in the so-called West, Western capitalism and other forms of capitalism, and the so-called free world, rejecting that, but also rejecting so-called actually existing socialism. And both of these ways of organizing society are rooted in social domination. We need to be opposed to them. So where do I see this? Well, you certainly see, if you look at the online resources that people who are radicalizing today go to when they want to learn about politics, and that's where most people go. Very different from when I was radicalizing and looking for resources. Look at YouTube, for example. It's all there. It's very common. You also see it in certain kinds of left-wing writing that you would find on, for example, the website of Jacobin. It's probably the most widely read English language left publication, or certainly one of them. And so I think that there are all sorts of ways in which different forms this is out there. And then you see it seeping into other places too. So I wouldn't want to exaggerate it, but there are a small number of left-wing academics who've kind of converted from their previous politics to Marxism-Leninism. Two names that come to mind, people from the US, are Gabriel Rockhill and Emmanuel Ness. And there are others too. So it's not just something that's happening amongst young people who are radicalizing. It's happening, among a certain current of people on the left.
So you analyze actually existing socialist societies from a perspective that you call reconstructed historical materialism. Can you tell me a little bit more about this perspective? How does it differ from cut and dry historical materialism, and why do you find it useful?
I want to just stress this is not something I invented. The term was mine, but it was really when I was writing my second book, which has the unfortunate kind of bland name, We Can Do Better, but which really should have been called something like Marxism for Our Times. I was looking for a way to name this approach that I was trying to write an introduction to, that has been developed by all sorts of people. And that approach is trying to bring together the best of the ideas of Marx and some of the people who've built on Marx, along with the best of the insights that have been developed out of various movements against oppression. So, feminism, anti-racism, queer liberation, indigenous anti-colonialism, and so on. but trying to kind of integrate this into a coherent perspective rather than just a kind of a spliced in, amalgam of ideas. So recognizing that there are really important ideas that you can find in classical historical materialism, but that tradition often generally didn't have a sufficiently broad understanding of what constituted social reality in terms of what's the material social world that we're in and are trying to change. It's got different dimensions that have been better understood by perspectives that have been generated by these struggles against oppression. So trying to put that together into an anti-racist, queer feminist Marxism was that's the approach that I find most convincing in terms of explaining how societies work and how they can best be changed. So just to say a little bit about that for people, I mean, it starts from the idea that humanity is a part of nature. We're a particular species. We have a social metabolism with that we interact with the rest of nature through this. So we take materials and energy from nature at the same time as we're shaping our environment. And as we do that, we change ourselves. And human societies are always about having to find ways of having babies, taking care of children and other people. We can call those two things together. We can call them social reproduction, and then also producing all the goods and services that we need. And those things all together are a kind of a single process of laboring, the labor of production and social reproduction. And so gender, class, and sexuality as social relationships are all generated out of that. And those social relationships are at the core of what I call a matrix of interlocking social relations. But within all those different social relationships, those core processes have more influence in terms of shaping how societies are organized and how they change over time than other relationships. So that's the approach that I try to take in the book to analyzing the societies in question. Although, certainly, admittedly, because the book is limited, it doesn't, for example, have a lot of space for writing about how gender was organized, for example, under so-called actually existing socialism. Although it does talk about that, and I do try to look at different dimensions of those societies.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear you explain it, because I see so much of the work that you do as being about what parts of communist tradition do we take up and enliven, and what parts do we leave behind. And, I remember you wrote for Briar Patch a lot about, say, the work of Rosa Luxemburg. And I think that that's a really valuable contribution, that careful thinking about what ideas from the past are still really useful for us and where do they need to be updated. And I found reconstructed historical materialism a really exciting tool in that vein of thinking carefully about what do we take with us and what do we update or leave behind. And so on your point about talking about gender in actually existing socialist societies, one thing that we're seeing when people who are new to radical politics come to socialism and communism, and they come to start to look at the details of actually existing socialist societies, is that some of these anti-capitalists start to celebrate the public services and rights that are offered by actually existing socialist societies. For example, gender equality laws or paid vacations that you would have seen in the USSR. And they do this in order to counter the capitalist narrative that socialism inevitably makes people's lives worse. But in Red Flags, you write that these public services and rights cannot be evaluated as distinct from the oppressive features of actually existing socialism. Can you tell me why that's the case?
Well, I think both of them were part of how the rulers of those one-party states ruled. How the people who were ruling in the USSR and other so-called socialist societies were always trying to grapple with the challenge of how do you make the direct producers, the workers and peasants, how do you actually make them work? Because you actually have to find a way of, to use a Marxist phrase, extracting surplus labor from people, actually making them work to produce the goods and services that you want. In this case, the state wants them to produce. And the working class in these societies did not control the workplace. They did not control production. They experienced alienated labor, and they experienced objective powerlessness in their work and in society. And so the rulers who were running what there's an economist named Jacques Sapir, and I use his phrase, he calls it a mobilization economy, which I think is a nice way of describing what these societies were about. So the state was trying to mobilize all available resources on a non-commercial basis to meet its objectives. And this meant that there was always a scarcity of labor power, or almost always, in these societies. And that meant as workers had a certain amount of bargaining power, right? Because unemployment could not really be used as a threat or a motivator to make workers work. That was, there were exceptions, but in general, this was true. And so then there's the question of how do you make people work? And these ruling parties used both what we call sticks and carrots to try to motivate. And so the stick was, well, repression. Any kind of organizing independent of the party state was banned and repressed. Independent trade unions or any other kind of independent organization. So there was that side of repression. But then you also had, you can't simply effectively over long periods of time rely simply on repression. You also have to find other motivators. And so public services, were one part of that, along with an ideology that promised people their lives would be better and would continue to get better into the future. So I think we need to look at these things in tandem together, rather than what Sophie Lewis calls, she's a feminist communist writer, she calls cherry picking from the Soviet policy pantheon when she's criticizing this approach of trying to look at the good bits and not look at how they were interconnected with really undesirable aspects of society. So I think we need to look at these things together. It's not to deny the existence of, some of these societies had certain kinds of public services that were as good or better than what people in most of the world have today. But those things didn't exist separately from the repression. And we shouldn't make the mistake of, when we analyze those societies, following the same kind of logic that would say, well, look at, say, Scandinavian social democracy, Scandinavian welfare states in the 1970s, that those had all sorts of positive features. Therefore, we should be pro-capitalist because those were capitalist societies, right? So I think it's the same logic that we need to reject.
Yeah, I think it comes from a feeling of pessimism about what we can actually achieve. That to say, our goal, our project is that of human liberation, is that of communism as fully realized. I think to a lot of people that feels too ambitious, unrealistically ambitious, and they're willing to settle for paid vacations and some better policies for women and racialized people. But in actuality, there's a lot more that we could win if we were willing to be ambitious about it and willing to acknowledge that the limits of what we're able to achieve do not stop at these kinds of reforms.
I think that's a really crucial point. And I just want to say one thing about it because you brought it up. I think is really important if we want to understand the appeal of these societies in the past that get pointed to, or even for that matter, people who point to China today and say that is a society on the road to the kind of society that we want. And so I think it's just a lot about the fact that we're living in this historical moment where it's very pessimistic, as you say. And there's a brilliant essay by Barnaby Rain, who have had on this podcast before, that was published in the journal Salvage, and you can find it on the Salvage website. But he calls this phenomenon, he writes, the name of the essay is Left Fukuyamaism. And what does he mean by that? So Francis Fukuyama, the State Department intellectual in the US, who wrote about the end of history after the collapse of the USSR. So the idea that the collapse of the USSR meant that that was the exhaustion of one model of society, and basically the humanity had arrived at liberal capitalism, and that was the end point. And so what Barnaby Rain is suggesting is that there's this kind of mentality today that suggests that from the left, any imaginable future would in fact be in some ways just recapitulating something from the past. That we would not consider the possibility that we could have a society qualitatively different than anything we've seen before, and qualitatively better. And so I think that unconsciously shapes the way a lot of people think today about the future, rather than thinking about something that would be really qualitatively different and boldly different for humanity. That the best we can hope for is, a better version of something that we've already seen in the past.
Yeah, I think that a lot of listeners may never have actually heard that fully articulated, that vision of what our society could be like under communism. I'm wondering if you can articulate that, explain, and you kind of get into this at the end of your book, but explain to listeners about beyond these kinds of small reforms and tinkering with the status quo, like what are we aiming at?
Right. So I think it remains possible, which is different from saying that it's likely. We're saying it's possible that we could have a profound transformation of society, which launches a process of transition, the outcome of which would be a society without classes, without states, without oppression. That is in a sense, the traditional idea of communism. If you go back to, or certainly as it was understood as a liberatory politics that developed in the middle of the 1800s, when theorized by people like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who were picking up on and contributing to ideas that existed before them, but were rethinking those kinds of politics amidst the emergence of working class struggles at that time. So it's not a question of saying that we would leap from capitalism today straight into that kind of society, but the idea of a process where you break with capitalism and begin a transition towards a society where people produce what's needed or to meet human needs rather than production for profit, and that this is done in a profoundly democratic way. And that's a break from the dominant tradition of anti-capitalist politics, which was much before Marx and Engels and after Marx and Engels as well, continued to be much more authoritarian and didn't appreciate the importance of self-emancipation, the idea that in order to make this break and launch the transition, it would have to be a process that would be carried out by working people freeing themselves, liberating themselves through their own struggles. So on the one hand, we don't know that this society is possible. We don't have the ability, we don't have a religious faith that tells us, this kind of society is definitely possible because it hasn't existed. But rather we can say that there are all sorts of good reasons, and I try to sketch this out at the end of the book, to say that this kind of society is, or at least a society that's moving very much towards this is definitely possible, and it should be our horizon. It should be the political horizon that we aim towards. It helps us to navigate through the struggles in the here and now in a way that points towards that future possibility. So that's the horizon that I bring to bear on looking at the so-called actually existing socialist society.
Thank you. That's really helpful. So connecting back to this point about the pessimism of the now, and that being one thing that kind of attracts people to looking to actually existing socialist societies for, inspiration. You, in your book, connect declining trust in mainstream media with a rise in conspiracy theories and in anti-communism. This declining trust in mainstream media, you quote from a socialist writer called Richard Seymour, who calls it, quote, radical skepticism about reality. I found this really, really interesting as someone who is a journalist, who works in media, who has sort of seen firsthand and really up close this declining trust in not only mainstream media, but like a shared reality to some extent. Can you talk a little bit more about this, how you're seeing that declining trust in mainstream media and rise in conspiracy theories become linked a little bit to the attractiveness of some of the anti-communist ideas?
So I guess we're all faced with the question, how do we know what we know? Or how do we know what we believe? That's true when it comes to, what's the reality of China today? What was the reality of China under Mao? What was the reality of the Soviet Union under Stalin or his successors? But it's the same question, like, is QAnon true? What do we believe about COVID-19? Like, on some level, there's a commonality. Who do we trust? What sources do we trust? And so I think there are problems here, and we're on the one hand we're saturated with mass-produced digital images. So what's real and what's fake is maybe harder to discern than it was before. Deep fakes are easier than ever to generate. And I wanted to draw here on something which I've read since writing the book. So Richard Seymour's new book, Disaster Nationalism, talks about this more than in the little essay that I had read at the time when I was writing. And he writes about how knowledge depends on trust in society. And the kind of social trust that we have is anchored in our social conditions. And so if the social conditions of neoliberal capitalism are corroding social trust, then this is going to affect how we think about what we believe and what we don't. So Seymour writes in Disaster Nationalism, if knowledge is a social state, then the degradation of knowledge is a consequence of that social corrosion. In the empirical sciences, trust has been eroded by the proliferation of fraudulent scholarship, papers ghostwritten by corporations, and the collusion of a supposedly independent academia in the marketing strategies of companies they partner with. In media, trust has been eroded by the obvious political biases of owners, the influence of advertisers, the fusion of news with infotainment, the rise of journalism, and the social industry platforms that thrive on turning attention surges generated by addictive disinfotainment into advertising revenue. In everyday life, the decay of interpersonal trust, which appears to be slightly more advanced among younger generations, makes even the testimony of our neighbors doubtful. What remains in this situation, pitifully euphemized as post-truth? The final fiduciary trust is in the transparency of reality to conscious reflection. If no one else will tell me the truth, I can at least see it for myself. And what's left of that when the simulacrum takes over? So I think that's insightful about the conditions we find ourselves in. And it shapes lots of things, including what we believe when it comes to so-called social societies and related issues. So, if we're hearing from the far right and from liberals all sorts of anti-communism, it's quite understandable that people who recognize what dealers of death these people are, right? We reject the lies that they say about Gaza. They reject the lies that they say about life, getting better for people, or other things that they're also going to reject in a similar kind of way. Just change the sign. So where our rulers say something is good, we say it's bad. When they say it's bad, we say it's good. And so then that attitude applying to whoever's being demonized by our rulers and the people that we reject. So I think this is a real challenge in general, and it affects lots of things politically, including when people are trying to look at the history of the left.
Yeah, and we're sort of staring down the barrel of this kind of picking up steam in the coming years as we're looking at a Trump government and a prospective Poilievre government, and thinking about how this might influence anti-communism, and that orientation of, well, they say X, so we say the opposite is true. So given what we're looking at with the state of the rise in power of far-right governments in North America right now and in the coming years, how do we produce a social reality that supports a more clear-eyed view of actually existing socialism and of communism?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I do think that the more we're going to hear anti-communism from the far right, the more we can expect in response to it anti-communism as a response by people who are on the left and radicalizing. Not the only response, but I think it will become more common. So it is a problem. I mean, ultimately, if we think about this, I think what it will take to really change the conditions around this is an upsurge of social struggle, an upsurge of working class struggle or struggle of oppressed people that really an organization that comes out of that begins to generate deeper and wider solidarities, and which raises people's expectations about what kind of society we could have. And those conditions are ones which would be fostering of trust. It would certainly be an antidote to the trends that I was talking about when quoting Richard Seymour earlier. Struggles that generate real freedom dreams with high expectations, and the idea that we might have a vision of a society which is a genuinely liberated society that's really new and different in a profound way, rather than being a revival of something that's already existed in the past, but without the undesirable features. In other words, a vision of freedom that challenges the kind of left Fukuyamist end of history politics. And I think it's interesting to think back, actually, just to jump back, to think about how I think the growth in interest in so-called socialist societies and Marxism-Leninism actually began in the wake of the decline of the social struggles of the Occupy moment. I think if we look at history of the 21st century, it was after the decline of those struggles, the so-called movements of the squares in Europe, and after the defeat of Syriza going over to neoliberal austerity of Syriza in Greece, and so on. That was a wave of struggle that happened after the so-called Great Recession of 2008, 2009, the beginning of the global slump. So in the wake of the decline of those struggles, I think a different political sensibility emerged, and that was in those conditions we began to see that revival. So I think we're still kind of in that phase in a sense, but it's even getting worse because of the rise of the far right. And so it will take, I think, new forms of social struggle that actually leave their imprint to begin to raise expectations and challenge how people think about this at a deep level. It's not like people are going to start thinking differently about these historical societies and traditions as a starting point, but it's more if we begin to rethink some fundamental assumptions about politics, then that will create a different context for thinking about these issues.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think both the higher expectations and the involvement of people in social struggle, because I think that some of the anti-communism that comes from a circumstance in which the far right says something anti-communist and then the left reacts to it in an anti-communist way is like, I see a lot of the ways that those arguments are developed and those dynamics play out as one of people fighting online, and that sometimes the way that anti-communist arguments are developed in order to sort of detonate anti-communist arguments works very well online, but doesn't necessarily hold up that well in conversations among humans in real life. And that trying to have these conversations in the context of people who are organizing and struggling together on the ground introduces new nuance, new perspectives, and changes what form of the argument for communism is persuasive, and strengthens those higher expectations and strengthens the nuance of those conversations about communism and what we're aiming for.
I think that's a really great point. Like, it's one thing to do it as a meme, right? But once you actually engage in the discussion and push back, it doesn't really hold up. Or the way people try to defend the position gets to be more and more tenuous. But like so many things, the more we can break off these discussions from having them online and have the discussions in person, the better it gets.
Yeah. So coming back to what's in the book itself, I want to give readers a sense of what's at the heart of some of the arguments that you make. And you argue that actually existing socialist societies like the USSR, China, and Cuba were never on the road to communism, but always were and still are capitalist. Insofar as they still exist. So China and Cuba still are capitalist. Can you sort of summarize what you say in the book about why this is? I found a lot of the examples that you shared really powerful, so I'm hoping that you can share some of those examples that you found that support the conclusion that these societies were never on the road to capitalism or to communism.
Right. Okay. So, the first thing I'll say, and this is, I think, the key argument, it's a negative argument about what these societies were not, right? Saying they were not on the road to communism. So I should just say that the term actually existing socialism was a term that was developed in the East Bloc to describe those societies by their own ruling class intellectuals. And to say that these were never on the road to communism in the sense that I talked about it before. In other words, they were never in transition towards a classless and stateless society of freedom. That's a central argument that the book makes. The book argues that for a society to be in transition towards that kind of goal, for that kind of social reorganization to be underway, you have to have, it's not an optional extra, you have to have profound political and economic democratization. Because there's a relationship between the process and the ends here. So, shortly after Karl Marx died in the 1880s, the English socialist William Morris, writing with another socialist, used the phrase that the direct control by the people of the whole administration of the community would be necessary in a society that was in transition. And Rosa Luxemburg, in the early 20th century, wrote about how the great laboring mass ceases to be a dominated mass, but rather makes the entire political and economic life its own life and gives that life a conscious, free, and autonomous direction. So I think those are just two classical quotes that really capture the whole idea that in order to actually make progress in a transition towards the kind of society that we're talking about, it has to be that process of liberation by, to use a Marxist term, the direct producers, the workers and peasants themselves, in order to actually have any possibility of moving in that direction. So the book tries to provide a lot of evidence to show that these societies were never moving in that direction in terms of how they were organized. And then there's the question, though, it's a secondary question, which is in a positive sense, what kind of societies were they, right? So not what were they not, but what were they? And this is, to me, it's important, but it's less important than the fundamental argument that they were never in transition. So what do we find in these societies? Well, the central political bureaucracy of the state, which was a one-party state, that's the ruling class in these societies, and that central political bureaucracy exploited or exploits the direct producers, workers and peasants in societies where there's a significant class of peasants. So direct producers don't democratically decide what the goals of production in their society are. They don't also have any ability to decide what goods and services are going to be produced. So their condition is a condition of alienated labor, lacking control of their own labor. Okay, so then, well, what kind of mode of production are we talking about here? To use a term from historical materialism, what way of organizing social production do we find? There's only two possibilities. Is either this is a new non-capitalist form of class exploitation, or it's a variant of capitalism. And I'm persuaded that this was in fact a variant of capitalism that existed in the so-called socialist societies. And why is that? Well, the central political bureaucracy in these societies didn't exist in a vacuum. So it was running the so-called mobilization economy, but the decisions it was making about what to produce and how to produce it, those decisions were shaped by geopolitical competition, which is ultimately military competition to have powerful armed forces, competition with Western capitalism. And this geopolitical competition forced the rulers of these societies to try to raise the productivity of labor towards the levels that existed in the advanced capitalist countries that they were rivals with. And to the degree that the rulers of these societies were able to do that, they were imposing the logic of capitalism in those societies. But this was a highly distorted version of capitalism, taking to a whole higher level the kind of distortion that existed in a society we might be more familiar with. If you look at, for example, societies in the West during World War II, Canada, the US, Britain, and so on. During the World War II, the state orchestrated the war economy, which most of which remained in private hands, but there was also a significant amount of state-owned enterprises, and that certainly wasn't conventional capitalism. We see today all sorts of situations where banks and other corporations are deemed too big to fail, and the state intervenes or acts to maintain them. So capitalism never exists in a pure form without the state shaping it in particular ways, but this took it to an entirely higher level. And I do want to just quote from one South Korean researcher, Kim Yong-uk, who's done some really interesting research using sources from China about the organization of society under Mao Zedong back in the 1960s. And Kim's research on this, I'm going to quote their writing here, talks about how party state officials in China compared production in particular sectors with production in those same sectors in the US, the USSR, Japan, and other countries. So to quote Kim, they compared not just the total quantity of output or the total value of output, but also the rate of increase in labor productivity. as China attempted to adjust the productivity of the concrete labor of its workers in terms of massive products and automation to the level of its competitor countries, this acted as a form of intense pressure towards equalization and synchronization. And they also made this comparison, again, quoting Kim, using monetary values expressed in international currency. One result was that even though China's heavy industry was not incorporated into processes of international exchange, international competition was nearly always the decisive factor in how and where living and dead labor was put to use within China, regardless of the domestic needs of the country, neither the needs of the bureaucracy nor the people. So that's Kim's conclusion, drawing on Chinese primary sources, and it confirms analysis that was really first developed by E. Gale Gluckstein, better known as Tony Cliff, first writing in the 1940s about the character of the USSR. So it's on that basis that I think that we can conclude that this was ultimately a variant of capitalism.
Yeah, that's fair. It makes me think of like Cuba post-revolution, transitioning a lot of its crops to be cash crops that were bought by the USSR. And then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba having like lost a lot of its food sovereignty because a lot of the crops that they were producing were like, not actually able to feed their population, and also, weren't bringing in a lot of money for them because there was no world power that was willing to buy them at inflated prices. So one other thing that we kind of touched on earlier in this episode, and I want to circle back to, is the sort of tension between nostalgia and tradition that I see in a lot of your work, and that I think also comes up in Red Flags. So in the book, you're critical of nostalgia, and you write that nostalgia for the once powerful seeming Marxist-Leninist tradition is a, quote, poisoned well. And also, you encourage the use of communist tradition as a source of ideas to guide efforts to change society. And something that I thought was really interesting is you also talk about an imaginative element to communism. So you insist that the future is not just the present projected forward, that actually the future is open to being a lot better or a lot worse than the present. Can you talk a little bit more about your work, both in this book and beyond this book, if you'd like, about trying to balance building on tradition with imagining what hasn't yet been created?
Right. It's an interesting question, and I grapple with it depending on who I'm talking with. I think it makes a big difference, because I think there's a risk that those of us, people who are on the revolutionary left, sometimes our problem is sometimes being overly defensive about the traditions that we come out of, or thinking that they're more sufficient, and we don't need to develop our politics as much as I think we do. But that's, so with certain kinds of discussions among comrades, I might find myself more frustrated with a kind of defensive attitude towards defending certain traditions. But then more broadly, when we think about anti-capitalists today, I think the fundamental challenge is the fact that people are not drawing in ways that in the best ways on our best traditions. So I do think that we have the question. We always have the question: where do we get our politics from? Where do we get our ideas about what our goals are going to be, and ideas about strategies and tactics? And so, whether we realize it or not, we're not just generating these ideas out of our own heads, right? We're going to be drawing these ideas out of things that we, read, that we or hear, and as well as our own experiences. And we can often end up thinking, people often end up thinking that new ideas that they're putting forward are new, when in fact they're not new at all. They're actually very old political ideas. And so I think we should be consciously trying to draw from the long tradition of anti-Stalinist communism, both Marxist and anarchist, which I have a chapter about in the book, tradition which sometimes I call socialism from below, not my own original term, to be sure. That's a tradition which has always refused to accept the idea that bureaucratic one-party dictatorships can be moving towards small c communist societies. And I think that tradition is truly a treasure trove of ideas about our goals, our strategy, and our tactics. But it's not a source of answers to every question that we face today, and it's not we shouldn't try to look for an off the rack political program that we would just be able to pull down and apply. We do stand on the shoulders of giants, to use that slogan or that phrase, but that doesn't absolve us of the responsibility of thinking for ourselves in the conditions that we find ourselves today, because our conditions are not the conditions of Marx and Engels or of Rosa Luxemburg or of the people who were the fighters of 1968, right? Or any other period of the past. We are in the moment of history that we're in, and we need to try to analyze the conditions we find ourselves in and act in those conditions in a way that's oriented by the communist horizon that I talked about earlier, and that we have to try to act in ways that are informed by having a strategic sense of how we can advance the struggle towards or in the direction of that horizon, and apply tactics, recognizing that there are really important historical experiences that we want to draw on, but we're not simply living through the same situation that any of the people we're reading lived through in the past. So it's about getting the balance right between, we have to understand the tradition, understand as much as we can about past experiences in order to distill from them lessons, but also we need to use the tools, the concepts of analysis that we can get from that tradition to analyze our own circumstances, and not just try to apply them, simply apply things ready-made. So I think that's true, for example, when we grapple with what's happening in the US today, right? If I think there are problems with people who think this is simply a rerun of what we saw in the 1920s and 30s with the rise of fascism in that period. But it's also a problem if we aren't recognizing what's genuinely new. Like, this is simply not the same conservatism that we saw in the late 20th, early 21st centuries either, right? So that's just one example of a challenge that we face today in terms of trying to analyze and act. So maybe I'm not sure if that's kind of drifted a little further off than where you wanted to go, but it's a couple of thoughts about that.
Yeah, no, it is really helpful. I think I often have moments where I yearn for an off-the-shelf manual to politics and political action today, and I wish that there was a really clearly laid out roadmap, or a complete historical analog or precedent for the things that I'm working on today, but there just isn't. And also, I think, if I'm being honest with myself, if I were to approach political action as like following an instruction manual, it would lose so much of the things that draw me to political struggle, which is the exercise of human creativity and solidarity and ingenuity. And so, as frustrating as it is to have to walk this balance beam between tradition and invention or imagination, I think it also is a really powerful exercise and practice in the kind of skills that we'll need to create and sustain a society that moves towards and hopefully achieves human liberation. So something else that I really noticed that you did very carefully in the book, and I want to talk about in this podcast, is, I'll say this, it's going to be a bit of a controversial book. There are going to be people who really disagree with some parts of this book. They're going to, mostly, I'm thinking of people who are really staunch Marxist-Leninists. And I think you knew that going into it. And I think, the title of the book, Red Flags, kind of like pokes at it a little bit. And it doesn't shy away from the fact that this is going to be a book that some people disagree with the arguments and the conclusion. But I also saw throughout the book that you tried to be really fair. You weren't sort of, you didn't issue a blanket dismissal of the possibility that ideas around actually existing socialism and actually existing socialist societies had contributed anything good. And I wanted to hear a little bit more about that effort that you make throughout the book to be really fair and to say, this was an organizer that was involved in a party that, overall was a Marxist-Leninist party that perhaps was like, kind of advancing politics that were not on the road to communism. But there are some things that are admirable here. What was your thinking around trying to bring that level of fairness into the book and not sort of just outright dismiss 100% of the entire Marxist-Leninist tradition and people who worked within it?
Okay, yeah. That's first of all, I should say for listeners who may not be familiar with all of this, that so Marxism Leninism as an ideology, I think, developed in the 1920s as the ideology of the rulers in the USSR. And it's not the same as the ideas of Marx and Lenin. I mean, it's a particular ideology that was developed at that point, and I say a little bit about it in the book. But it became the ideology of the majority of the revolutionary, or much of the radical left globally, and a huge number of people who wanted to change the world for the same reasons that we want to change the world adopted that way of understanding, that and that the strategic approaches that they derived from it, and joined organizations that were committed to this ideology, and fought in so many ways against all the forms of exploitation and oppression that needed to be fought, and suffered enormously and died for this. And I think we have to have a level of respect for people in the world today, but certainly as well, and historically, who've been part of social struggles, but participated in them in ways guided by politics and by theories that we don't share, but nevertheless, we're part of the history of class and social struggles. And so there's, I think, a level of humility and respect that we need to bring to bear on this, because these are human beings, not abstractions, I guess, right? That we have to think about both. You can read the articles and you can pull your hair out reading the articles written by the leaders of communist parties that were, in their worst instances, just propagating lies about what the reality was in the Soviet Union, or pushing disastrous strategies like refusing to ally with social democrats to stop the Nazis from coming to power in Germany in the early 1930s, or trying to build alliances with the so-called progressive wing of capitalist classes that led to putting the brakes on explosive struggles from below. But these disastrous politics were implemented by people, by fighters in workplaces and communities who unfortunately often remained stubbornly loyal to their parties and to the societies that they were identifying with, and yeah, we have to kind of grapple with that. So I do try to in the book acknowledge this, and I mentioned one particular former Communist Party member that I remember in Toronto when I lived there years ago, who was fired for his name was Stan Dalton, and he was fired for his militancy working at the Seton House shelter in Toronto, along with two other shop stewards from the CUPE local, CUPE 79. And so that particular person, who I knew when I was in my early 20s, just stood out to me as one of many examples of courageous class fighters who had political ideas and allegiances that were different from mine. And I think we just have to bear that in mind. We can acknowledge the contributions that people made, and at the same time acknowledge ways in which, or to the extent to which their allegiance to Marxist-Leninist politics actually did not help them in waging the struggles that they were waging, or gave them a very contradictory mix of both in some ways positive and in other ways very unhelpful ideas to take into struggles. And so I think we have to think about the same thing today. In the Philippines, the Communist Party of the Philippines is the largest force on the radical left in that country, and members of that organization and the groups that are kind of associated with it suffer from all sorts of state repression, and that's awful. We obviously need to be in solidarity with people in struggle against the terrible conditions that they face. At the same time, as we also shouldn't in any way be blinkered about the politics of that party. The fact that in the past it's actually carried out assassinations of its political opponents on the left, people it disagrees with. And we shouldn't put on the pedestal. There are some people on the left in this society who, I think, not knowing anything about the fact that there are other political currents on the radical left in the Philippines, have a tendency to want to kind of cheerlead for what they see as a powerful force in the global South, and on the basis of not knowing very much, and then end up, just reproducing or perpetuating a completely inaccurate idea about what that reality is. So I think this is not just about the past; it's also about the present. We could talk as well about this various Marxist-Leninist organizations in India, various other parts of the world where there are significant forces.
Yeah, I really appreciated that level of humanity that you brought to the book. That it's you have really high expectations for the quality of ideas and strategy, and also bring a gentleness on individuals that I think is helpful, and encourages people to work in strategic and solidaristic ways on the road to communism. So there's a quote in the conclusion of the book that I love, and I keep coming back to it ever since I first read an advanced reading copy of the book many months ago. And the quote that you pull into the book is written by the British socialist Maurice Brinton. I'm going to read it out loud. Brinton writes, "Meaningful action for revolutionaries is whatever increases the confidence, the autonomy, the initiative, the participation, the solidarity, the equalitarian tendencies, and the self-activity of the masses, and whatever assists in their demystification. Sterile and harmful action is whatever reinforces the passivity of the masses. Their apathy, their cynicism, their differentiation through hierarchy, their alienation, their reliance on others to do things for them, and the degree to which they can therefore be manipulated by others, even by those allegedly acting on their behalf." It's a way of sort of like taking up Rosa Luxemburg's argument that a transition to communism can, quote, be brought to victory only by the great majority of the working people themselves. It's sort of a way to think through what it means to be one of these working people, how we can act from that place and from that conviction. I think the reason why this quote has been really powerful for me and that I've kept coming back to it is that as a journalist, it helps me think through what kinds of media I want to make. So, for example, I try to work on making media that expands people's ability to weigh ideas, to spot lies and omissions, to think for themselves, that expands their feeling of their own potency and responsibility, their ability to recognize patterns and where and when and how right-wing and left-wing politics show up around the world. There are very great pressures and trends toward collaborating with social media corporations and creating journalism that disempowers and pacifies readers. But I try to avoid doing these things in the spirit of Maurice Brinton, in the spirit of what he calls meaningful action. Can you talk about how this comes up in your own political work, David? How you take meaningful action even when there are so many pressures to take sterile and harmful action?
Well, I guess I try to do my best, but we're obviously, in a sense, prisoners of our circumstances, right? And so we're often this is very small things, trying to put this approach into practice, trying to act in ways that are informed by that kind of socialism from below politics. I mean, I guess one example would be I always try to promote democratic decision-making by the largest possible number of people in an organization, within, for example, the union that I'm part of. And I want to mention an example that stuck with me, which certainly wasn't just me, but I was part of. So back in the year 2000, when I was a member of QP Local 3903 at York University, and we were on strike, it was a very long strike. It was 11 weeks. But a really important moment in that strike was when we'd been having effective picket lines, effective enough that the employer said that if we didn't move our picket lines off the York property line, like just outside the actual property line of the university, that they were going to call the police on us to, have us arrested. And lots of unions in that situation would have just folded and moved the location of their picket lines. And instead, we had a membership meeting and discussed and decided to defy this, because it would have meant actually moving picket lines like into the street, into Kiel and places like this. That would have actually been, it would have been really difficult to maintain the picket lines in the same way, the same strength. So, and we called their bluff. They figured they didn't want to have on the news all pictures of people, being peacefully picked up and carried away by the police in large numbers. And we did call their bluff. I mean, they backed down. They didn't follow through in that. But that was an example of where, because there were a whole number of us in that union who were committed to this kind of democratic participatory unionism, it wasn't just an executive that went and made a decision. Where they might have made that decision in a closed room with a lawyer telling them what they were at risk of or something like that. They would have probably come up with a different decision, or they would have been under pressure to make a very different decision than when there was a mass meeting where people could feel their collective power, and the decision could be a decision made democratically by all the strikers. So that's one example that I was part of. On a much more modest scale, I was part of efforts to try to open up Winnipeg Labor Council back in 2017, when kind of an independent thinking person managed to become president, much to the chagrin of the local people that really call the shots in the labor scene. Didn't last very long, unfortunately, but the attempt to actually open up that labor body in the city was, I tried to put into practice that kind of approach that you were quoting. I guess more generally, I try to foster and encourage other people to foster the development of independent thinking socialist organizers. That is, we need people that learn from tradition, but learn to think for ourselves with ideas, rather than, just kind of unthinkingly apply a set of maxims from the past. Or just, the flip side of that, we would be just opportunistically trying to fumble our way through, without guidance without having strategic and tactical orientation that we can apply in a consistent way. So I think that's something that we need to try to do. And I guess I also just try to avoid ever deceiving myself or deceiving others, because I do think the saying "only the truth is revolutionary" is true. And this is, I guess, personally, I went through an experience that was very important to me. So I became a socialist when I was in my teens, when I was in high school in Ottawa. And I joined the International Socialists, which was a Trotskyist organization, very different from, the organization still exists. It's very different from what I joined in 1988. And I got a very good classical Marxist education in that group. And it gave me the tools, and some other people in the group, the tools that we then used to ultimately criticize and leave the group. In beginning of 1996, we formed what was called the New Socialist Group, which I was then part of until it eventually ran out of gas and dissolved. But I just think the experience of being in an organization that I felt, at the time had a leadership that was either deceiving itself, but certainly was deceiving other people, and was not honestly grappling with the reality of the society we were in and what was politically possible. That was an important experience for me. So, and I think it just taught me, or reinforced for me, the importance of actually trying to, if we're serious about socialism from below, we have to try to inform our practice in the here and now with those politics. It's not like we should have, on the one hand, we shouldn't affirm socialism from below principles, and on the other hand, just opportunistically adapt ourselves to the conditions we find ourselves in, and act in ways that are really, really just short term and governed by what we think will be to our immediate advantage. But we have to actually have a longer view, and sometimes our ability to make a difference, to try to get the organizations we're in to do things differently than they might otherwise, that might be very limited. But in other situations, there'll be more opportunities. And if we're not actually trying to do that, we won't be able to take advantage of the unexpected opportunities when they do arise, right? So you have to know those politics and be always grappling with how you can apply them, recognizing that you're often going to get it wrong, in one way or the other, but that you keep it up and are attentive to the unexpected, which sometimes is good. Like, the unexpected is not always bad, right? The unexpected sometimes is the unexpected opening where there's the opportunity to act collectively in a way that wasn't there before, or to act collectively in a way that's different than would have been done otherwise. And so that's what trying to be politically active as a socialist is about, I think.
Thank you so much, David, for coming on your own podcast as a guest, for briefly handing the reins over to me to get to interview you. It's been such a delight.
Well, thank you so much for being the host and for these wonderful questions and this conversation. It's been great.
So, Red Flags, A Reckoning with Communism for the Future of the Left is coming out from Fernwood Press in April 2025. Right now, it's available for pre-order from fernwoodpublishing.ca. I really encourage you to pre-order the book if you're interested in reading it. It is a brilliant read. And to tell others about it, especially people who are new to radical politics. Pre-orders are important because it helps an independent press like Fernwood prepare for a book's launch and fund the last stages of production of the book. Again, you can go to fernwoodpublishing.ca to pre-order it. That is it for this episode of Victor's Children. A big thank you to Jonathan Kroger, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom this podcast would not be possible. Thank you also to Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found this episode worth listening to, please tell other people about it. Word of mouth recommendations are really helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please take a second to give the show a high rating, since it helps to promote the show. If you have a suggestion or constructive feedback, feel free to email David at victorschildren@gmail.com.
David here with an announcement about a special offer for listeners of Victor's Children. If you order Red Flags directly from the website of Fernwood Publishing, you can get a 15% discount from now until 6 months after the release of this podcast episode. So just go to Fernwood Publishing and use the code RF15. That's RF as in Red Flags 15 as a discount code to get 15% off orders of the book. Hope many of you will take advantage of this offer. Thanks for listening.